They called Americans demons, monsters who tortured prisoners and left them in ditches to rot. So when 247 Japanese women stepped off that transport ship in San Francisco Bay on September 12, 1945, they were ready to die. What they got instead would destroy them in ways no bullet ever could. Hot showers, clean beds, chocolate bars, and soldiers who smiled. 3 days later, the whispers started in the barracks. We've never seen men like this. What happened next didn't just change these women. It shattered everything they believed about honor, about enemies, about their entire lives. And if you think you know how this story ends, you're wrong. Because the real twist isn't what the Americans did to them. It's what happened when they went home. The fog was so thick that morning you could taste it. Cold and gray, turning the whole world into a ghost. The transport ship groaned through San Francisco Bay like something dying. And on deck, 247 Japanese women gripped the rails with white knuckles, waiting for the end. Most were young, 18 to 30. Nurses, radio operators, translators. They'd served the Imperial Japanese Army across the Pacific, and now they wore torn uniforms, matted hair, hollow faces. Some clutched bags with everything they owned, others had nothing at all. Through the fog, the Golden Gate Bridge appeared like a red dream rising from the water. In Japan, bridges were rubble. Here was a bridge that touched the sky. Perfect. Impossible. Untouched. They'll kill us when we land, Ko whispered to Yuki beside her. Ko was 22, a nurse from Osaka. Her voice shook. Yuki, a radio operator from the Philippines, said nothing, just stared at the shore with her jaw clenched. The propaganda had been clear. Americans were savages. They'd torture Japanese women, strip their dignity. Death would be mercy. The ship's horn blasted 3 times. Women flinched. Some cried. Others whispered prayers to ancestors. A few stood frozen, minds blank with terror. Then they saw them. American soldiers on the dock below. Dozens of them, standing in loose formations, smoking cigarettes, talking casually. Not snarling, not shouting threats, not even pointing rifles, just waiting. Some were laughing. One soldier waved up at the ship. Casual, almost friendly. Did you see that? Ko grabbed Yuki's arm. He waved. Maybe it's a trick, Yuki whispered back. To make us feel safe before. She didn't finish. Neither wanted to imagine what came after before. The gangway lowered with a metallic clang. A Japanese-American translator stepped forward. You will exit in single file. You will be processed, given medical checks, assigned quarters. No harm will come to you. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. Geneva Convention? Ko had never heard those words. They descended slowly, reluctantly. Each step felt like walking toward execution. And below, the American soldiers watched with expressions that weren't angry or cruel, but something else entirely. Curious. Almost gentle. Ko's foot touched American soil. She expected horror. Instead, the first soldier she passed smiled at her. Not cruel. Not mocking. Just a smile. Somehow that was more terrifying than any weapon. Inside the white building that smelled of disinfectant and flowers, female American nurses waited in crisp uniforms. Women. The Americans had sent women to process them. Please remove your uniforms, the translator said. You will be given clean clothing after your medical examination and shower. Panic rippled through the group. Remove their uniforms? In Japan, modesty was everything. To be undressed by strangers was worse than death. But what choice did they have? The nurses moved among them with gentle efficiency. No judgment, no mockery. They handed each woman a white towel and pointed to the next room. The medical exam was quick but thorough. One nurse noticed Ko's trembling hands and placed her own hand gently on Ko's shoulder. It's okay, she said in English. Ko didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone, the kindness in the woman's eyes. Ko burst into tears. Then came the showers. Dozens of shower heads lined the walls. Steam filled the air, warm and thick. The translator explained they should wash thoroughly, take as much time as needed, and there was soap. Real soap. The women stood frozen, staring at white bars sitting on shelves beneath each shower head. They picked them up slowly, as if handling something precious and fragile. The soap was smooth and smelled like flowers, like lilacs, like a world that hadn't been destroyed. Yuki turned the water on and gasped. Hot water. Not lukewarm, not cold. Hot. She hadn't felt hot water in over a year. Around her, women were crying as they washed. Some laughed through tears, the sound high and almost hysterical. Others stood under the water, letting it run over their faces, washing away months of dirt and fear and exhaustion. Ko scrubbed until her skin turned pink, washed her hair 3 times. The soap lathered thick and white, and the smell of flowers surrounded her like a dream. She thought of her mother's garden in Osaka, cherry blossoms in April before the war came. When they emerged, they were given clean undergarments, simple gray dresses, soft cotton socks. Some women stared at themselves in mirrors, hardly recognizing their own reflections. Clean. They looked clean. An older woman named Tomoko touched her face in the mirror, eyes wide. "I forgot," she whispered. "I forgot I could look like this." But beneath the relief was something darker. Confusion. Shame. They were supposed to be suffering, supposed to be tortured. Instead, they'd been given soap and hot water and clean clothes. What kind of enemy does this? The mess hall could fit 300 people. Long tables covered with clean white cloths, and the smell. Bread baking, meat cooking, coffee brewing. The scent was so overwhelming several women stopped in the doorway, unable to move forward. "Please take a seat," the translator said. "Lunch will be served." They shuffled to tables and sat, backs rigid, hands folded. This couldn't be real. Maybe the food was poisoned. Maybe this was the last meal before torture began. American soldiers in kitchen uniforms appeared, carrying large trays. They moved down the rows, placing plates in front of each woman. Ko stared down at her plate and felt her breath catch. Roast chicken, golden and glistening. Mashed potatoes with brown gravy. Green beans. Thick white bread with yellow butter. A glass of cold milk. A cup of steaming coffee. She hadn't seen this much food on one plate in 3 years. No one moved. No one ate. They just stared at the food as if it might vanish. "Please eat," the translator said gently. "It's for you." Still no one moved. Finally Yuki picked up her fork. Her hand shook as she cut a small piece of chicken and lifted it to her mouth. She chewed slowly, eyes closing. The taste exploded on her tongue. Rich. Savory. Real. She started to cry. That broke the dam. Women all around began to eat, some slowly, carefully, others frantically, as if the food might be taken away. Tears streamed down faces as they chewed. Some laughed between bites, desperate and joyful. Others ate in silence, unable to process what was happening. Ko bit into the bread and gasped at the soft texture. She'd eaten bread made from sawdust for the last year of the war. This bread was soft, white, perfect. She spread butter with trembling fingers and took another bite. The richness made her dizzy. Across the table, Tomoko was crying so hard she couldn't eat. She held a piece of chicken in her hand, staring at it, body shaking with sobs. "My children," she whispered. "My children are starving in Tokyo, and I'm eating chicken." The guilt hit all of them at once. While they sat eating roast chicken, their families in Japan were picking through rubble for scraps. Their children were eating grass soup. Their parents were dying of starvation. And here they were. The enemy was feeding them better than their own country ever had. Some women pushed their plates away, unable to continue. Others ate everything, driven by hunger so deep it overrode shame. A few ate and cried at the same time, tears falling into their mashed potatoes. The American soldiers watched from the edges of the room. One young soldier whispered, "They're crying. Should we do something?" "Just let them eat," an older soldier replied quietly. "They'll be okay." But would they? Ko wasn't sure of anything anymore. After the meal, they were led to barracks, simple wooden buildings with small windows and neat rows of beds inside. Not mats on the floor, not piles of straw. Actual beds with metal frames, mattresses, pillows, and folded blankets. Each bed had a small wooden trunk at its foot. The translator explained they could keep personal belongings in the trunks. They could write letters home. Paper and pencils would be provided. Letters home. They could write to their families. Ko chose a bed near the window and sat down slowly on the mattress. It was soft. She pressed her hand into it, feeling it give, then spring back. She hadn't slept on a mattress since leaving Japan 2 years ago. Beside her, Yuki ran her hand over the wool blanket. "It's thick," she said softly. "It's winter in California, and they gave us thick blankets." At the end of the room, a small wood stove sat ready. The translator explained it would be lit in the evenings to keep them warm. Tomoko sat on her bed and buried her face in her hands. "This is wrong," she whispered. "Everything about this is wrong. We're prisoners. We're supposed to suffer. We're supposed to pay for what our country did." She looked around at the beds, the blankets, the windows with curtains. Instead, they treat us like human beings. That night, darkness fell and lights were dimmed. The women lay in their beds, wrapped in warm blankets, listening to unfamiliar sounds. Trucks rumbling in the distance, soldiers calling to each other in English, the low hum of generators. Outside, crickets chirped. Somewhere a radio played music, soft and jazzy and utterly foreign. Ko pulled her blanket to her chin and stared at the ceiling. Her body was warm. Her stomach was full. She was clean. She was safe. And she had never felt more confused in her entire life. She thought of propaganda films showing Americans as monsters with no souls, no honor, no mercy. She thought of officers who told her surrender meant torture and death. She thought of everything she'd believed about the enemy. Then she thought of the soldier who smiled on the dock, the nurse who touched her shoulder with kindness, the chicken on her plate, the soap in her hands. Everything she knew was a lie, and that realization was more terrifying than any battle she'd ever witnessed. The days took on a rhythm that felt surreal. Every morning at 6:30, a bell rang. Gentle and clear. The women woke, dressed, made their beds with military precision, a habit none could break, even as prisoners. Breakfast at 7 mo. Oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins, scrambled eggs, toast with jam, fresh fruit, apples, oranges, sometimes bananas, coffee and milk. Every single morning, this abundance appeared as if by magic. Work assignments followed. But these weren't brutal labor details. Some women were assigned to the camp laundry, washing uniforms in large mechanical washers that did most of the work. Others worked in kitchens. A few with English skills translated documents or taught Japanese phrases to curious American soldiers. Ko was assigned to the camp hospital, helping nurses with basic tasks, folding bandages, organizing supplies, cleaning equipment. The work was light, almost gentle. She worked alongside 2 American nurses, Helen and Margaret, who treated her not as an enemy or prisoner, but as a colleague. They showed her how to use equipment, taught her English words, sometimes shared their lunches. The most shocking part? They were paid. Every Friday, each woman received small amounts of camp script, paper currency that could only be used in the camp, but was worth something nonetheless. With this money, they could visit the camp canteen. The women stood in front of the candy display like children at a shrine, eyes wide. Chocolate bars, Hershey's, Nestle, Baby Ruth. In Japan, chocolate had disappeared years ago. Here, enemy prisoners could buy it with their labor wages. Cigarettes, lipstick, hand lotion, pencils and notebooks, small bottles of perfume, handkerchiefs with embroidered flowers. These weren't necessities. These were luxuries, things that made life more than mere survival. Yuki bought a chocolate bar on her first visit. She carried it back like a treasure, unwrapping it slowly, breaking off one square at a time. The sweetness melted on her tongue. "I'm eating chocolate," she whispered to Ko. "We're prisoners of war and I'm eating chocolate." Lunch at noon, always hot, always substantial. Dinner at 6, with meat at nearly every meal. In between there were breaks, rest periods, even time for recreation. The Americans had set up a small library in one building, stocked with Japanese books they'd somehow acquired. The women could check out books, read, discuss stories with each other. On Sundays, there was no work. The women could rest, write letters, or attend religious services. A Buddhist chaplain visited once a month. Christian services were available every week. The Americans accommodated both. This routine, this strange, gentle, almost domestic routine, began to wear down their resistance more effectively than any torture could have. Their bodies grew stronger. Color returned to their cheeks. They gained weight, hollow faces filling out, bones no longer pressing sharp against skin. But with physical health came mental turmoil. Because every day of comfort was also a day of guilt. Every meal was a reminder their families were starving. Every bar of chocolate was a betrayal of everyone's suffering back home. And yet they couldn't stop accepting it. Couldn't refuse the food, the warmth, the small kindnesses. They were trapped not by barbed wire, but by the paradox of an enemy who treated them better than their own country ever had. At night, women gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices, trying to make sense of it all. Some clung desperately to old beliefs, insisting this kindness was a trick, that Americans were only being nice because they wanted information. Others had begun to question everything they'd been taught. The war was over. Japan had lost. And in losing, they'd discovered something that shook them to their core. The enemy was not what they'd been told. The enemy was something far more complicated, far more human, and far more frightening. Ko's first letter from her mother arrived in late October. She sat on her bed in the evening light and opened it with trembling hands. The paper was so thin she could see through it. Her mother's handwriting, once elegant, now wandered across the page in uneven lines. My dear Ko, we received word that you are alive and a prisoner in America. This brings me both relief and sorrow. Tokyo is gone. Our house is rubble. Your father and I live in a shelter made from metal sheets. We eat once a day if we are lucky. Today we had rice water and a few leaves of cabbage. Your little brother grows thinner each week. He asks about you constantly. He remembers you bringing him sweets before the war. There are no sweets now. There is hardly anything. But we are alive, and that is enough. I hope you are not suffering too much. We pray for you every night. Your loving mother. Ko read the letter 3 times, hands shaking harder with each reading. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her trunk. That night she couldn't eat dinner. She stared at the roast beef and carrots and saw her little brother's thin face. She pushed the plate away and went back to the barracks. She wasn't alone. All around her, women were receiving similar letters. Letters describing starvation, homelessness, desperation. One woman's husband had died of malnutrition. Another's parents had been killed in firebombing. A third received word her children had been sent to live with relatives because there was no food in the cities. The contrast became unbearable. Here in California, the camp was surrounded by abundance. Beyond the fences, American towns bustled with life. Stores were full of goods. Children played in parks. Families drove cars down clean streets lined with houses that had never been bombed. The women could see it when they were taken outside for work details. Life continuing, normal and untouched, as if the war had happened on another planet. Yuki worked in a field one day, harvesting vegetables alongside other prisoners. At lunchtime, the American guard supervising them opened his metal lunchbox and shared his sandwiches with the women. He did this casually, as if it were nothing. Ham and cheese on white bread wrapped in wax paper. He handed out sandwiches like a man feeding birds in a park. My wife makes extra, he explained through the translator. She knows you girls are hungry. His wife, a woman he'd never met, had made sandwiches for enemy prisoners because she thought they might be hungry. Yuki took the sandwich with both hands, bowing deeply, tears streaming down her face. That night, she wrote in her journal, the guard's wife sent sandwiches. She doesn't know us. We were her enemies. Her country fought ours and people died. But she sent sandwiches. How am I supposed to hate people like this? How am I supposed to remain loyal to an empire that let me starve while the enemy feeds me? The physical transformation was impossible to hide. The women looked healthier than they had in years. Skin glowed, hair shone. They had flesh on their bones again. Tomoko stood in front of a mirror one morning, staring at her own face. I look like I did before the war, she whispered. I look healthy. I look fed. She touched her cheek, feeling the softness, the absence of sharp bone. Then she thought of her children's gaunt faces in the last photograph she'd received, and she turned away from the mirror, unable to look at herself anymore. The guilt was crushing. To be well fed while your family starved. To sleep in a warm bed while your parents lived in rubble. To eat chocolate while your children foraged for grass. This was torture more sophisticated than any beating. The torture of being shown mercy when you believed you deserved punishment. Of being treated with dignity when you expected cruelty. Of discovering that everything you'd been taught about honor, sacrifice, and enemies was a lie. And the lie cut deeper than any blade. Co was carrying a stack of folded linens to the hospital one afternoon when she tripped on an uneven floorboard. The linens flew everywhere, white sheets scattering across the hallway. She dropped to her knees immediately, scrambling to gather them, face burning with shame. In Japan, such clumsiness would have earned a sharp rebuke, maybe worse. But instead of anger, she heard laughter. Not mocking laughter, but warm, gentle laughter. She looked up to see one of the American doctors, a young man named Captain Miller, grinning at her as he knelt down to help. "Happens to everyone," he said in English, which she didn't understand. But his tone was clear. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even annoyed. He was just helping. Together, they gathered the sheets. When they were done, he handed her the stack and gave her a mock salute, still smiling. Then he walked away, whistling a tune she didn't recognize. Co stood in the hallway for a full minute, holding the sheets, trying to understand what had just happened. An officer, an American officer, had knelt on the floor to help her, an enemy prisoner, pick up laundry. And then he'd smiled at her. Who were these people? Another day, Yuki was walking back from the fields when she heard music. She followed the sound to an open window in one of the American barracks. Inside, a group of young soldiers were gathered around a phonograph, listening to a jazz record and laughing. One of them saw her standing outside and waved her closer. "You like music?" he asked through gestures. Yuki nodded hesitantly. The soldier disappeared inside and returned with the record. He handed it to her. "Gift," he said, using one of the few Japanese words he knew. "Puri sento." She stared at the record in her hands. Glenn Miller and his orchestra. She tried to hand it back, shaking her head, but the soldier refused. "No, no. You keep it. For the girls in your barracks." That night, the women gathered as Yuki played the record on the small phonograph provided for their recreation. The music filled the barracks, bright and brassy and utterly American. Some women frowned and turned away, unable to enjoy the music of their enemies. But others closed their eyes and swayed slightly, letting the rhythm wash over them. Music was music, regardless of where it came from. The most powerful moment came in November when the first cold snap hit California. The women woke one morning to frost on windows and breath visible in the air. They huddled under their blankets, dreading the cold. But at breakfast, the American commander made an announcement through the translator. "We've ordered additional blankets and warm coats for all prisoners. They should arrive by next week. In the meantime, we've increased the coal for your stoves. Stay warm." That was all. No fanfare, no expectation of gratitude. Just a simple statement that they'd noticed the cold and were taking care of it. Tomoko sat at breakfast with tears streaming down her face. "They notice when we're cold," she whispered to the women around her. "The enemy notices when we're cold and brings us blankets." She thought of the winter her family had spent in Hiroshima 2 years earlier, before the bomb, when they'd burned furniture to stay warm because the military had requisitioned all the coal. She thought of her children's blue lips and shivering bodies, how her own government had looked at its citizens and seen nothing but resources to be used and discarded. And here was the enemy bringing blankets because prisoners might be cold. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. In these small moments, the doctor helping with laundry, the soldier giving away his music, the commander ordering blankets, their worldview began to crumble completely. Because how do you hate someone who treats you like a human being? How do you maintain loyalty to a cause when the enemy shows you more care than your own leaders ever did? These questions haunted them, and there were no good answers. By December, The internal war raging within each woman had become more brutal than any external battle they'd witnessed. Ko lay awake most nights, staring at the dark ceiling, her mind spinning in circles that never reached a conclusion. During the day, she worked in the hospital, helping the American nurses. She'd learned enough English now to understand basic commands and even engage in simple conversations. Nurse Helen had started teaching her medical terms, patiently repeating words until Ko could pronounce them correctly. Yesterday, Helen had squeezed Ko's shoulder and said, "You're a natural at this. You should be a nurse after the war." After the war. As if there was an after. As if Ko had a future beyond this barbed wire. Beyond this strange limbo of being an enemy treated like a guest. At night, she pulled out her mother's letters and read them by flashlight under her blanket. The words never changed, but they cut deeper each time. Hunger, cold, desperation, her little brother growing weaker. Her father coughing blood because he'd given his food ration to the children. And here she was, gaining weight, learning English, being called a natural by an American nurse. The guilt was physical. It sat in her chest like a stone, making it hard to breathe. Yuki's struggle was different, but equally painful. She'd been a dedicated patriot, a true believer in the Emperor and the cause of Greater East Asia. She'd volunteered for military service, believed every word of propaganda, been willing to die for Japan. But now, every belief she'd held was cracking apart. She'd been told Americans were racist, that they'd treat Japanese people as subhuman. Yet every day she saw American soldiers treating them with casual respect that made no sense within her worldview. She'd been told American culture was shallow and corrupt, yet she found herself humming the jazz melodies she heard on the radio. She'd been told surrender meant dishonor worse than death. Yet here she was, alive, clean, healthy. And the dishonor she felt had nothing to do with surrender, and everything to do with how comfortable she'd become. One evening, she sat in the barracks with her journal open, trying to write her thoughts. But the words wouldn't come. Finally, she wrote, "I have become the enemy. Not because I am being held by Americans, but because I have started to see them as human. And in seeing them as human, I have betrayed everything I was taught. But if what I was taught was a lie, then what was I loyal to? What did I sacrifice for? And if the sacrifice was for nothing, then what am I?" The question hung there on the page, unanswered and unanswerable. Around them, other women were experiencing their own private crises. Some dealt with it by doubling down on hatred, refusing to speak to Americans, eating their food in bitter silence, taking the comfort but rejecting any human connection. Others went in the opposite direction, embracing their new reality with enthusiasm that bordered on desperation. They learned English eagerly, laughed at soldiers' jokes, listened to American music without guilt. They seemed to shed their Japanese identity like an old coat, wrapping themselves in American approval. But most women existed somewhere between these extremes, torn, conflicted, unable to fully embrace either position. They were caught in psychological no man's land, too changed to return to who they'd been, but too Japanese to fully accept who they were becoming. The Americans, for their part, seemed oblivious to this internal struggle. They saw prisoners who were adjusting well, who were healthy and cooperative and even friendly. They didn't see the midnight tears, the guilt-ridden journals, the whispered conversations about loyalty and betrayal. Or maybe they did see it and simply didn't know what to do about it. The debates started quietly, in whispers after lights out. But as weeks passed, they grew louder, more heated, more desperate. "We are still Japanese," insisted Fumiko, a former translator who'd worked in the Philippines. She was one of the hardliners, refusing to learn English, refusing to smile at Americans. "Nothing they do changes who we are. They feed us because the Geneva Convention requires it, not because they care. This is all political theater. When we return to Japan, we will be judged by how we maintained our dignity in captivity." "What dignity?" Yuki shot back, voice sharp and bitter. "We were sent to war by men who promised us victory and glory. They gave us neither. They gave us starvation and defeat. And now the enemy feeds us, clothes us, treats us like human beings, and we're supposed to feel ashamed of that? I'm done being ashamed." You're being brainwashed, Fumiko snapped. This is exactly what they want. To make us forget who we are. To make us grateful. To make us complicit. Complicit in what? Ko asked quietly. She was sitting on her bed, hugging her knees to her chest. The war is over. Japan lost. What exactly are we being complicit in by accepting food and shelter? In our own humiliation, Fumiko said. In the narrative that America is the merciful victor, and we are the grateful defeated. In the lie that they are better than us. Maybe they are better than us, said Sachiko, a young woman who was only 19. Maybe not better, but different. I was taught Americans had no honor, no respect for human life. But I've seen more respect here than I ever saw in the Imperial Army. I watched officers beat soldiers for minor infractions. I watched commanders send men to certain death and call it glory. Here, I see soldiers who joke with each other, who treat their officers like human beings, who follow orders but don't worship them. That's not weakness, that's something else. It's democracy, Tomoko said softly. She was the oldest woman in the barracks, in her late 30s, and her words carried weight. I read about it before the war, in books that were later banned. The idea that people can question authority, that leaders serve the people instead of the other way around. I thought it was a fantasy. But watching these Americans, I think maybe it's real. Democracy didn't stop them from dropping atomic bombs on our cities, Fumiko countered coldly. Democracy didn't stop them from firebombing Tokyo, from killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. Don't romanticize them just because they're nice to us now. Silence fell over the barracks. Fumiko was right, and everyone knew it. The same country that gave them chocolate and blankets had also unleashed destruction on a scale that defied comprehension. How could both things be true? How could Americans be capable of such kindness and such cruelty? Maybe, Yuki said slowly. That's what makes them powerful. They can do both. They can destroy their enemies completely and then treat them with mercy afterward. That's not weakness. That's strength. Terrifying strength. The conversations continued night after night, never reaching resolution. Generational divides emerged. Older women who remembered Japan before militarism were more willing to question what they'd been taught. Younger women who'd grown up with propaganda struggled more to let go of their beliefs. Some women stopped participating altogether, retreating into silence, unwilling to confront questions that had no good answers. Others became obsessed with the debates, arguing for hours, as if finding the right words could somehow make sense of the senseless. But beneath all the arguments, beneath all the intellectual wrestling, was a simple, devastating truth that every woman felt, but few could articulate. They had been lied to about the enemy, about the war, about what loyalty and honor meant. The lies had cost them everything: their homes, their families, their sense of identity. And now they were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered worldview, trying to build something new from the rubble. It was exhausting. It was painful. And it was necessary. Because they couldn't go forward until they acknowledged the truth. And they couldn't go back to what they'd been before. They were trapped in the transformation. And the only way out was through. The turning point came in late December when the camp organized a Christmas celebration. The women watched in fascination as Americans decorated a large tree in the recreation hall with lights, ornaments, and a star on top. They'd never seen anything like it. The commander announced through the translator that prisoners were invited to attend the Christmas party. There would be special food, music, and gifts. Gifts for prisoners of war. Most of the women attended out of curiosity. They sat in rows of chairs, watching as American soldiers performed songs and skits. Some of the entertainment was clearly meant to be funny, though the humor didn't always translate. But the Americans were trying. They were putting on a show for their prisoners, trying to give them joy. Then came the gifts. Each woman received a small wrapped package. Ko opened hers with trembling hands and found inside a bar of soap, a comb, a small mirror, and a chocolate bar. Simple things, practical things, but wrapped in bright paper with a ribbon, as if they were precious. She stared at the gifts in her lap and felt something break inside her. Not break in a painful way, but break open. like a seed cracking to let new growth emerge. These weren't lavish gifts. They weren't trying to buy her loyalty or gratitude. They were just human. One human giving another human something small and kind because it was Christmas. That's when Coe understood. The Americans weren't treating them well because of some calculated political strategy. They weren't following the Geneva Convention out of fear or obligation. They were doing it because this was simply how they treated people. Even enemies, even prisoners, even Japanese women they'd been at war with weeks earlier. This was the dangerous truth. American power came not just from bombs and bullets, but from the idea that every person had value, that even your enemy deserved basic dignity, that victory didn't require cruelty. This was the ideology they'd been fighting against. The idea that individuals mattered more than the collective, that human rights existed regardless of nationality or loyalty. And it worked. It was working on them right now. Every meal, every blanket, every small kindness was a demonstration of this philosophy. You could destroy us with your armies, these actions said, but we'll rebuild you with our mercy. We'll show you that there's a better way. Yuki sat beside Ko, holding her own wrapped gifts, tears streaming down her face. "It's not a weapon," she whispered. "It's just who they are. That's what makes it so devastating." Around them, other women were crying too. Not sad tears, but something more complicated. Tears of release. Tears of recognition. Tears of grieving for beliefs they'd held, and sacrifices they'd made for those beliefs. Tomoko stood up, walked to the front of the room, and bowed deeply to the American commander. The room fell silent. Through the translator, she said, "Thank you for treating us like human beings. We didn't expect this. We were taught to expect cruelty. But you have shown us something different, something we don't fully understand yet. But we are grateful." The commander looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight, face slightly red. "We're just following the rules, ma'am," he said. "Geneva Convention requires proper treatment of POWs. We're not doing anything special." But they were. They absolutely were. Because following rules that protected even your enemies, treating prisoners with dignity even when your own people had died at their hands, choosing mercy when you could choose vengeance, that was everything. That was the whole point. As the party continued, something shifted in the barracks. The hardliners became fewer. The debates became quieter. A collective exhaustion settled over the women, the exhaustion of resistance finally crumbling. They couldn't maintain their hatred in the face of this relentless humanity. They couldn't cling to propaganda that called Americans demons when those demons were giving them Christmas presents. They couldn't remain loyal to an empire that had abandoned them when the enemy was the only thing keeping them alive. The transformation wasn't complete. It would take years, maybe decades, for some women to fully process what had happened to them. But in that moment, in that decorated hall with a Christmas tree and wrapped gifts and American soldiers singing carols, something fundamental changed. They began to see their captors not as the enemy, but as people. Flawed people, certainly. People capable of terrible things, definitely. But people, nonetheless. And in seeing that, they began to question everything else they'd been taught. The most dangerous weapon America possessed wasn't the atomic bomb. It was the simple, radical idea that human dignity transcended national boundaries. And that weapon was working exactly as designed. The mirror moment came in January 1946, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Ko was working in the hospital, organizing medical supplies in a storage room, when she caught sight of her reflection in a glass cabinet door. She stopped moving. Stared. Didn't recognize herself at first. The woman in the reflection had round cheeks, clear skin, bright eyes, healthy hair that shone even in the dim storage room light. She looked young again. Alive. The hollow, haunted look that had defined her face for the last 2 years of war was completely gone. She looked like she had before the war. No, she looked better than she had before the war. Because even in peacetime Japan, she had never eaten this well, never had access to this level of medical care, never been this healthy. The enemy had done this. The enemy had restored her to herself. Ko's hands began to shake. She braced herself against the cabinet, breath coming in short gasps. Because in that moment, seeing her own healthy reflection, the full weight of the betrayal crashed over her. Not betrayal by the Americans, betrayal by her own country. Japan had taken her youth, her health, her innocence, and used them as fuel for a war machine. Japan had fed her propaganda instead of food, given her ideology instead of medicine, demanded her sacrifice while offering nothing in return. Japan had told her that suffering was noble, that hunger was honorable, that dying for the emperor was the highest calling. All lies. All of it lies. Because here she stood, a prisoner of war, healthier and happier than she'd ever been as a free citizen of the empire. Here she stood, fed and clothed, and treated with dignity by the very people she'd been taught to fear and hate. The Americans hadn't broken her with cruelty. They'd broken her with truth. The truth that she was worth feeding, worth caring for, worth treating like a human being. And that truth demolished everything she thought she knew about loyalty, honor, and sacrifice. She slid down to the floor, back against the cabinet, and sobbed. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal and wounded. She cried for the girl she'd been, who'd believed the propaganda. She cried for the years she'd wasted serving a cause that had never valued her. She cried for her family still suffering in Japan, still trapped in the lie. She cried for all the people who died believing their sacrifice meant something, when really they'd just been fuel for men who didn't care about them at all. Nurse Helen found her there 10 minutes later. The American woman took one look at Ko's face, and understood, somehow without words. She sat down on the floor beside her, not touching her, not trying to fix it, just sitting with her in her grief. "It's okay," Helen said softly, even though Ko barely understood English. "It's okay to be angry. It's okay to feel betrayed. You were lied to. You have every right to grieve for that." Ko looked at her through tear-blurred eyes. This woman. This American woman, who had every reason to hate her, whose country had been at war with hers, who had probably lost friends or family to Japanese bullets, was sitting on a hospital floor offering comfort to an enemy prisoner who was having a breakdown. And in that moment, Ko's worldview didn't just crack. It shattered completely. She understood now. This was what democracy looked like. This was what it meant to believe that every individual had inherent worth, regardless of which side of a war they were on. This was the philosophy Japan had been fighting against. The idea that human rights weren't granted by emperors or earned through sacrifice, but simply existed because humans existed. Japan had lost the war. But more than that, Japan's entire ideology had been proven hollow. Because when you put the two systems side by side, one that treated humans as tools for the state, and one that recognized humans as individuals with dignity, the difference was undeniable. She thought of her little brother in Tokyo, starving. She thought of the American soldier yesterday who'd shared his lunch with her. She thought of the emperor in his palace, untouched by the suffering of his people. She thought of the American commander ordering extra blankets for cold prisoners. The comparison was devastating and undeniable. That evening, Ko stood in the barracks and spoke to the assembled women. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I saw myself in a mirror today," she said. "I looked healthy, and I realized that I look better now, as a prisoner, than I ever did as a free citizen of Japan. And that's not because America is perfect, it's because Japan failed us, completely and utterly failed us." She looked around the room at faces both sympathetic and resistant. "I'm not saying we should forget who we are. I'm not saying we should become American. But I am saying we need to acknowledge the truth. We were lied to about the war, about the enemy, about what our country was fighting for. And until we acknowledge that, we can't move forward." Silence filled the barracks. Then slowly, one by one, women began to nod. Some cried, some looked away. But most nodded. Because they'd all seen themselves in mirrors. They'd all felt the cognitive dissonance of being healthier in captivity than in freedom. They'd all wrestled with the same devastating realization. The enemy had treated them like human beings, and in doing so, had revealed that their own country never had. That was the moment everything changed. Not gradually, but suddenly. Like a dam breaking. The resistance, the denial, the desperate clinging to old beliefs. All of it washed away in a flood of painful, liberating truth. They were still Japanese. They would always be Japanese. But they would never again be the women who'd believed the propaganda, who'd trusted blindly, who'd thought that suffering for the state was noble. They had been transformed. And there was no going back. As winter turned to spring, rumors of repatriation began to circulate through the camp. Ships were being prepared. Arrangements were being made. Soon the women would be sent back to Japan. The news should have brought joy. They were going home. Back to their families, their country, their culture. This was what they'd been waiting for, wasn't it? But instead of joy, the women felt dread. Ko lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, stomach twisted in knots. What would she find when she returned? Her mother's letters painted a picture of utter devastation. Tokyo was rubble. Food was scarce. Disease was rampant. The Japan she remembered, of cherry blossoms and festivals and order, was gone, replaced by chaos and hunger and despair. And she would return to it healthy, well-fed, with flesh on her bones and color in her cheeks. How would she explain that to her starving family? How would she look her little brother in his hollow eyes and tell him she'd been eating roast chicken while he foraged for weeds? "I'm afraid," Yuki confessed one evening as they sat on their beds. "I'm afraid to go back. What kind of person does that make me? Japan is my home. My family is there. But the thought of leaving here—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "Do you feel guilty?" Tomoko finished for her. "Because this camp, this prison, has been kinder to us than our own country ever was. And that's not something we can say out loud without sounding like traitors. But it's true." "It's true," Sachiko said quietly. "I've been trying not to think about it. But it's true. I don't want to go back to starvation. I don't want to go back to a country that sees women as nothing but tools for men. I don't want to go back to being told that my worth is measured only by my service to the state." The conversations continued, always in whispers, always tinged with shame, because what they were admitting was unspeakable. They had come to prefer captivity in America to freedom in Japan, not because they loved America or had abandoned their identity, but because basic human needs, food, shelter, dignity, mattered more than abstract concepts of loyalty and patriotism. Some women began to ask American officers if they could stay, if there was any way to remain in America rather than return to Japan. The answers were always the same: no. The Geneva Convention required repatriation. They had to go back. But the asking itself revealed how much had changed. These women who'd been taught that death was preferable to dishonor were now begging to stay with their former enemies rather than return to their homeland. The propaganda had said Americans would break them, and in a way, the propaganda had been right. But the breaking hadn't come through cruelty. It had come through something far more powerful: the simple demonstration that there was a better way to live. The ships departed in April 1946. The women stood on deck, watching San Francisco Bay disappear behind them, the Golden Gate Bridge shrinking on the horizon. Many cried. Some waved goodbye to the American guards on the pier who had come to see them off. The journey across the Pacific took 3 weeks. The conditions weren't as comfortable as the camp. The ships were crowded, the seas rough. But they were fed regularly and treated with basic dignity. Nothing like the nightmare voyages of the war years. When the Japanese coast finally appeared on the horizon, the women crowded the rails, straining to see their homeland. What they saw made their hearts sink. Devastation. Complete and utter devastation. Cities reduced to ash. Harbors filled with half-sunken ships. Coastlines scarred by bombing. As they sailed past Hiroshima, the extent of the atomic bomb's damage became visible. An entire city simply gone, flattened, erased. They docked at Yokohama, and reality hit them with full force. Skeletal buildings, rubble-lined streets, people in rags picking through debris, children with distended bellies and hollow eyes begging for food. Women selling anything they had: clothing, family heirlooms, themselves, just to survive. This was what they were returning to. This was home. Ko stepped off the ship onto Japanese soil and felt no joy, only crushing sadness. Around her, other women were crying, not with happiness but with horror at what their country had become. They were processed through a repatriation center, given minimal supplies, and released to find their own way to their families. Ko boarded a train to Tokyo, watching the destroyed landscape roll past the windows. Burned forests, collapsed bridges, ghost towns where bustling cities had been. She found her family in a makeshift shelter in what had once been a prosperous neighborhood. Her mother had aged 20 years. Her father was sick with tuberculosis. Her little brother, now 12, was so thin she hardly recognized him. When they saw her, healthy, round-faced, clearly well-fed, their first expressions were joy. But the joy quickly turned to confusion, then to something else, something that looked like accusation. "You look well," her mother said carefully. "The Americans treated you well." Ko nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down her face. Because she understood what her mother wasn't saying. "You were eating while we starved. You were safe while we suffered. You were with the enemy while we lost everything." The guilt she'd felt in the camp was nothing compared to what she felt now. Years passed. Japan rebuilt itself, slowly transforming from ruins into an economic powerhouse. The occupation ended. Democracy took root, awkwardly at first, then more firmly. The women who'd been prisoners in America scattered across the country, rebuilding their lives, rarely speaking of their experiences. But they were changed. Fundamentally. Irrevocably changed. Ko became a nurse, inspired by her time working in the American camp hospital. She never married, choosing instead to dedicate her life to healing. In the 1960s, she opened a small clinic in Tokyo, treating patients with a philosophy she'd learned in captivity: that every person, regardless of status or background, deserved dignity and care. She kept her American nursing textbooks, the ones Nurse Helen had given her as a parting gift. Sometimes, when the clinic was quiet, she'd flip through them and remember the woman who'd sat with her on a hospital floor while she cried. Yuki married an American soldier during the occupation and moved to California. It caused a scandal in her family, but she didn't care. She'd seen enough to know that love and kindness mattered more than national pride. She raised 3 children who grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable with chopsticks and forks, teaching them that identity didn't have to be singular or pure. Tomoko returned to her children and spent the rest of her life trying to explain to them what she'd learned: that propaganda was dangerous, that questioning authority was not only acceptable but necessary, that their worth as human beings didn't come from service to the state, but from their inherent humanity. Most of the women never spoke publicly about their time as prisoners. The shame was too deep, the contradictions too painful, but privately, in conversations with daughters and granddaughters, they passed on what they'd learned. They taught the next generation to question, to think critically, to recognize propaganda when they saw it. They taught them that the enemy isn't always who you're told it is, and sometimes the people who treat you with the most humanity are the ones you least expect. And so the soap, the chocolate, the clean sheets, all of it became more than just physical objects. They became symbols of the most devastating weapon America possessed: the simple belief that every human life had value, even enemy lives, even the lives of those who had fought against you. For those Japanese women prisoners, the taste of chocolate and the smell of soap became proof that everything they'd been taught was a lie. That the enemy could show mercy. That dignity was more powerful than cruelty. That sometimes the hardest thing to carry isn't hatred, but kindness from those you expected to hate you. Ko, in her final years, told her niece about her time in the American camp. The young woman, born decades after the war ended, listened with wide eyes. "So the Americans were good to you?" she asked. Ko shook her head slowly. "It's not that simple. They dropped atomic bombs on our cities. They killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. They were capable of terrible things." She paused, looking out the window at modern Tokyo, all glass and steel and prosperity. "But they were also capable of mercy, of treating their enemies with dignity, And that mercy changed me more than any punishment could have. It made me question everything. And those questions led me to truth. Painful truth, but truth nonetheless. She smiled sadly. I spent my whole life trying to pass on what I learned. That your enemy might treat you better than your own people. That propaganda is always a lie, no matter who's speaking it. That human dignity transcends borders and nationalism. These lessons cost me everything I once believed. But they gave me something more valuable, the ability to see clearly. That is the story worth remembering. These women discovered that the real battlefield wasn't between nations, but between ideologies. One that saw humans as tools, and one that saw them as individuals worth protecting, even when they were your enemies. The enemy didn't break them with cruelty. They broke them with something far more dangerous. The truth that they deserved to be treated like human beings. And that truth changed everything. If this story moved you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. History is full of uncomfortable truths like this one. Stories that challenge what we think we know about enemies and allies, about war and peace, about who the real monsters are. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us what you think. Because the past has lessons for us, if we're brave enough to learn them.